Hello everybody and welcome back. In this video we're going to be specifically talking about grain. And if you're working in Photoshop you would call it texture. There are a few things that are similar to Photoshop, but on the other hand there's a few things that are significantly different and are really good at adding a natural look and character to the brush stroke. Before we get into the actual behaviors and dynamics of this grain menu, we should take a quick look at the source menu, and in particular at the bottom half, which is called grain source. And here's where you actually choose a grain or texture that will be used to stamp the grain onto each stroke. What I'm going to be using is a texture from the Procreate library called Noise. I like it because it's very uniform. There it is there. Compared to the other sources, which have sort of bits and pieces of the actual paper into it. It looks more like a scan of an actual piece of paper, whereas the Noise is actually I think it's probably digitally created, very much like the noise filter in Photoshop. But there you can actually choose whatever grain source that other people have made, or you can make your own. It's fun to experiment probably. Now back to the grain menu. I'm just going to basically start from the top and go down. The first slider we have is called movement. And that is actually how much the grain is smudged as you are drawing. If you move it all the way to the right, there is no smudging at all. So if I do a stroke, I'm going to make it bigger here. If I do a stroke, each grain or texture is very distinct. If I slide it all the way to the left, and you can see when I do that the word stamp comes up. You can see that the grain is basically dragged along and smudged. For what I do, I don't particularly like that smudging. I mostly have it all the way to the right or almost to the right. I suppose if you wanted a more impressionistic type illustration, that would be more appropriate. But I mostly prefer the setting more to the right, if not all the way to the right. I prefer to preserve the actual grain that I'm using, just to give the drawing more warmth and character. So on to the next slider, which is scale, and that's basically exactly what it says. It just increases the size of the scale of the grain. A good way to see the grain as you're doing a stroke is that you can actually do a stroke in the preview on the top of the grain menu to see what it's like. I mean, it's nothing beats the actual drawing on the surface. So the next slider is called zoom, which is actually once you figure it out, it's pretty easy, but it's one of the more difficult dynamics to understand. Basically what it is that it zooms up the grain as the size of the brush increases. So if I slide it all the way to the right, the grain, I'm going to increase the size of the grain so it's more apparent. The grain increases in size in relation to the brush size. Maybe if I lower the opacity, it becomes more apparent. Now if I slide it all the way to the left, and the word cropped shows up. It's basically just the size of the grain stays exactly the same throughout. I'm gonna lower the scale of the thing just to make it. So you can see the the grain is the same, increases as the brush size goes up, whereas over here it's basically the same brush, the texture that's stamped throughout. So in my opinion, this is more important with brushes that the size dynamic is turned on. When I mean size dynamic, I mean if you go under the pencil, there's the size is adjusted, so the harder I press, the bigger the brush stroke gets. So ideally I don't want to go back and forth into the menu to adjust the size of the grain. So I want basically I want the grain to be apparent in large strokes like here, and in smaller strokes like here. Now I have the grain cropped, so the grain does not actually adjust. It doesn't zoom according to the size of the brush. Now as you can see, I'm trying to draw the faces. Is more tighter. Is more of a tighter drawing, and there's more detail there. Now as you can see, the grain becomes too obtrusive. It becomes it breaks up the drawing too much, and it looks very blurry. Now if I go and adjust the zoom to the right, I'm gonna have to increase the scale of the grain as well. You can see that the grain is apparent in large strokes, and when I reduce the size of the brush, you can see that it becomes a tighter line because the grain doesn't overpower it. Now if I say that, okay, well I don't like that line, I want a little more grain into it, you can slide it to the left, and you can see the grain shows up more because it doesn't zoom down as much as the originally wanted. Yet if I do a large line, the grain does show up. So that's one of the reasons of having this zoom, is so that you don't have to go back and forth into the settings to adjust the grain size for that reason, because as I said, the grain becomes too large when you're drawing a small fine detail. But having said that, if you're going to be working on a different size resolution file, you still probably have to go in to adjust it, just because if you're working like this is a full screen resolution file, but if you're working on like thumbnails or a smaller resolution file, you probably want to lower the scale of the grain, just because if you have a large grain, you're doing a lot of small detail, it's gonna inhibit the amount of ink that you can get onto the screen. So now the fourth slider is called rotation, and I don't actually use this very much, but what it does is actually it smudges the grain on a different angle, whereas the movement smudges it in line with your stroke. The rotation smudges it on an angle. So you can see that there's some kind of, the angle of the smudge is that way. If I slide it the other way, you can see that the angle has changed. Whereas, I'll set it back to 0, if you the slide of the movement is in line with where the brush stroke is going. So the fifth thing to consider is the grain filtering, and that has more to do with anti-aliasing. If you're in typography, it's really important. If you zoom in on typography, something with a straight line without anti-aliasing looks very jagged when you zoom out. But if you blur it by adding pixels to compensate for the jagged line, it looks a lot more smoother. And I think that's basically what it's being done here. Now if I go to no filtering, let me clear the screen here. Oops, I'm going to turn off the movement here. You can see it's pretty digital looking. The grain looks pretty jagged. If I turn on classic, you can see it looks more natural. Kind of blurs it out a little more. If I go to improved, it's basically the same. I think maybe they adjusted the anti-aliasing to maybe make it more dynamic based on the stroke, or I'm not exactly sure. I've been trying to play around with it. I don't see much of a difference. So you can play around with it. So improved and classic, very much similar. The none, I can see when if you want to choose none, maybe if you're doing a very small line and you really want the grain to show up more, because when you're doing a smaller line, the grain becomes blurry anyways. So you want the grain to actually show up more. But if if you're in the improved or classic, if you set the zoom to follow your stroke, or set it to not follow the stroke as much, the grain shows up as well, possibly a little bit more blurred. So I suppose if you turn off the anti-aliasing, the line becomes a little more sharper, although a little bit, even though it becomes a little more digital looking. So to illustrate that point more, we're going to switch to a drawing that has that is actually part of a storyboard for an advertising campaign, but you can see the resolution is not full screen. It is actually more low res, in which case if I use the brush that's anti-alias, either classic or improved, and if I want the grain to show up, I'm going to increase the size of the grain there. As you can see, it has this kind of blurred effect, especially when you go into the detail. It has a kind of a blurred effect that looks not quite sharp. In which case I tend to go towards the no filtering and lower the scale of the grain. It tends to look more sharper because because of the resolution. It's already blurred a bit, so it's a kind of a natural sort of anti-aliasing. Anyways, and the smaller the drawing gets, you couldn't even actually turn the scale down to the furthest to the left, or to almost none. It would still actually show up. So that's fine for fine detail on a low res file. But if I wanted to draw the mother's face here, it even at the lowest setting, it's still the grain is a bit too big, and you know, it's too insistent. Even at the highest opacity setting. So another trick to do in that case is you go to the source and invert the grain. Right now, let's see, how should I put this? Wherever the black is where the holes are on the drawing. So you can see it's mostly white. So actually, you know, it'll be the opposite. It'll be mostly white, mostly black when I draw that. So as you can see, it's pretty sharp now. Whoops. And it takes less effort to draw the face. Okay, so you have a lot of options here to get the depending on the resolution of the drawing and how much detail you want and how fine you want the line to be. So I want to talk about the use of grain in a shading brush. And when I say shading brush, what I mean anyways is a brush that has, if you go into the pencil, no size variance or size dynamic. If you go to the pencil menu, you can see that the size is set to 0. So if you look at the brush stroke, the harder you press, it doesn't matter how hard you press, the brush size stays the same. But what does change is the opacity of the, or how much ink is applied to the screen. And the advantage of this is when you're shading, all the variance or the dynamic of the brush is applied to the variance of the opacity of the brush, and not to the size of it. So if I'm trying to shade his shoulder plate here, you can see that it's easier to get the subtleties of the shading, the shading variance, the opacity variance. Now if I'm just gonna adjust the size, dynamic. So that what happens now is the harder I press, the more ink is applied. Also, the brush gets larger. As you can see, it's a bit harder to get the subtleties of shading, because as I ease off on the pencil, the size of the brush gets smaller. Whereas I didn't want that. I wanted it to actually just get lighter. So as far as grain is concerned, with a shading brush, you want the grain to stay more even than the drawing brush. The drawing brush, you want, as you remember, you want the zoom to follow the brush more. So as the brush size gets smaller, you want the grain to be smaller, just so that you get a little more detail. But when you're shading, you want more of an even grain to the whole drawing. So you want to set the zoom more or less to the left. I mean, you can, almost to the left, so that when you're doing the grain, doing the shading, no matter how big the brush is, the grain stays the same size. Now, of course, this is more of a preference than gospel, but I think a lot of people would agree. So if you turn off the size dynamic on a shading brush, you can not only go much quicker, but the drawing tends to look less, has more immediacy and less, looks less overworked, because it takes less strokes to achieve the same thing, and that's the main goal of getting something to look fresh and natural and not overworked. And again, if the grain is even throughout, it looks more uniform. So there you have it. Yeah, it's probably a little hard to understand from the outset, maybe possibly even a little bit unintuitive, but the more you use it, the more it becomes second nature. You kind of, depending on the resolution of your drawing, depending on what you're trying to achieve, it's probably a good thing to go in there and adjust it, before you start your drawing. I actually go in there and adjust it even actually within the drawing itself. So yeah, don't be afraid to try it out. Thanks very much for watching. If you like this video, please do share it, like it, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and all that jazz. See you next time.